Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the webinar. This is Susan Moore with the Georgia Municipal Association, and we are going to be talking today about rights of way and about the FCC's recent order regarding telecommunications facility siting. I'm going to ask Corey very quickly to go over some housekeeping measures, including how to ask questions, and then we'll get into the meat of our presentation.
Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Please be aware that all participants are muted to avoid audio feedback issues. However, we do want you to ask questions. You can do this by typing your questions into the question and answer box in the lower right side of your screen. We will attempt to answer as many of these as possible at the end of the webinar. Also, please note the file box on the right side of the screen. By clicking on Wireless Presentation PDF and then clicking Download File, you can save a copy of Mr. Lederer's presentation to your computer. Also, please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and that the recording and other resources will be placed on the GMA website soon. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Corey. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Jerry Lederer. He's a partner in Best & Krieger's Municipal Law Practice Group in the firm's Washington, D.C. office. Prior to joining the firm in 2011, he was an attorney with Miller & Van Eaton, a nationally recognized telecommunications law firm. Mr. Lederer serves as legislative counsel to Telecommunity, a collection of local governments dedicated to ensuring respect for local rights in federal legislative activity, and outside counsel to a number of local governments, including 2 larger jurisdictions in Georgia. Jerry is a well-known advocate for public and private property owners regarding issues of law and policy arising from federal and state communications legislation and regulation. He's also one of the nation's leading experts on marketplace solutions for the integration of technology into commercial real estate. Without any further ado, I think many of you know Jerry from his speaking engagements at the International Municipal Lawyers Association or the Institute for City and County Attorneys. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jerry so that he can start our presentation and we can get to as many of your questions as possible. Jerry?
Thank you, Susan. And you can hear me okay? Yes. Susan, you can hear me? Terrific.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm a little worried. I see where Martin Clark is out there in the audience, and I know he's probably been up studying all night to ask me difficult questions. So, Corey, can we put a block on Martin so that we don't have to answer his? Look, here's the embarrassing message that I need to deliver to all of you right up front. The Georgia Municipal Association did a better job in lobbying at the state level than we did at the federal level. What we're going to do today is we're going to go through and talk about the FCC's new wireless facility rules, but we're going to do it from the perspective of not only what the rules say, but how they differ and actually further encroach on your authority than what Susan and her colleagues were able to achieve in the Georgia State Legislature. And so that's how we're going to try to roll today. Really do welcome questions. There's nothing more lonely than sitting here in my office looking at a computer screen. So I'd love to have questions. And Susan and Rue have agreed that they're going to keep their mic live. So if you hear them asking or interrupting me, please know that it's at my request. They're not showing any lack of Southern hospitality. So the caveats there, we're all lawyers. My sort of my reading notes on the bottom say blah, blah, blah. But we all have general counsels, and so I've met my general counsel's obligation. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a 155-page report and order that was adopted on October the 17th. It was released on October the 21st. And here we sit on December the 10th, and it still has not been published in the Federal Register. It's vitally important because it's Federal Register publication that starts the race. We're going to go through, there are a number of deadlines and shot clocks that we have to live by in terms of appealing or filing for reconsideration, or even for the effectiveness of the order. The order is not effective until 90 days after publication. and that has not yet happened. We think that probably will happen within another week or two. The reason for the delay appears to be that there are portions of the order that have to be approved by OMB because they create a paperwork obligation. We're not going to talk much about that today. You'll hear more coming later because the question that I have right now, I'm working with people that are OMB experts on how's the best way to sort of play that game over there. Is it to bring in a slew of comments, or is it simply to work behind the scenes? Because one of the most important issues that is whether the deemed granted portion of the order that we're going to talk about is not effective until OMB has authorized it. So there's no deemed granted within the first 90 days if OMB hasn't done it. It's also a portion of the paperwork dealing with showing somebody that their application is incomplete. That's another section that is going to OMB. So we'll talk about it. I also want you to download this presentation. And then if you go to that website that's listed right there, we did an hour-long presentation on just the order. We didn't talk about build, obviously, but on the order. And so if there's something that you didn't get, or if you want to hear my colleague Matthew Shettenhelm deliver the majority of this presentation, you can go there for a YouTube audio, and then the presentation's right in front of you. So again, what is it we're talking about today? We're talking about the FCC's new rules dealing with or effectuating Section 6409 of the Middle Class Tax Act, which was passed in 2012. And what the 6409 order does is it has sort of 5 parts to it. First of all, it creates this new shot clock dealing with a co-location that does not substantially change the diameters of or the characteristics of a tower, and we're going to go through that in detail. It also speaks to 332C7 in that it clarifies when 332C7 applies. The big insight there is that it applies to small cells and DAS that had long been an open question. I'm going to tell you that there are sections on NEPA, that's the environmental and historic preservation and temporary towers, and I'm going to provide you with an outline, but that's all I'm going to do there because the way that the commission sees it is those 3 areas, NEPA, historic preservation, and temporary towers, are the pretty much exclusive domain of the FCC and state historic folks, and they don't want you denying co-location requests because that paperwork hasn't been done. What you might do is you might want to give it subjected to those approvals, but please don't let those jam you up. And then finally, as reflected by sort of the state capitol there, our hope is to try to allow you to build your response to the new FCC rules consistent with the Build Act. First of all, the scope. What does this apply to? And the first thing to know is that the 6409 order only applies to Georgia municipalities in your regulatory capacities. It does not apply in your proprietary capacity. So, you've got Martin Clark out at the airport, and he's got wireless devices out there that he's allowed people to rent from him, space from him. It does not impact that. Okay, so when your community is acting in its proprietary capacity, this order does not impact you, i.e., a carrier cannot claim that they're entitled to put up a co-location for free on your property unless you've already surrendered that in your leases and licenses. So I'm hoping that people will circle that section and make it very clear to yourself that you go back and make sure that you haven't done that, and you certainly don't do that moving forward. I do need to build in one caveat, and that is that the Build Act does impact some of your proprietary rights. Now, I put that there just because I'm dealing with lawyers, and it's got to be specific and it's got to be listed. But in my opinion, Build does not negatively impact local governments in any way if we do our homework. If the Georgia Municipal Association members working together with their colleagues in commercial real estate like BOMA, whether it be BOMA Savannah or BOMA Atlanta, can clearly demonstrate value significantly more than we're typically getting for our sites. So I just don't see that as being a problem. I made a presentation in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the Build Act a little bit. And one of the people in the audience laughed and said, well, do you create the research project for the building owners and managers? And I said, yeah. And they said, well, so much for that being an issue. So again, I don't think anybody should ever allow that to impact you. We can get you documentation and we can get you market comps. You'll do just fine. So what are the new FCC rules? How are they consistent with build? And how do they affect you? And how might you best respond? Well, the first thing is, what do they apply to? What do these new rules apply to? I think we all understand that they apply to a traditional tower. But what we need to make clear is that they also apply to small cells and distributed antenna systems. And this is why in the title of today's presentation, we're talking about rights of way, because that's where most of these are going to be deployed. And so we've got the same questions. We had a question going in to the 6409 proceeding. The question was, does Section 332C7 apply to DAS? Because DAS couldn't figure out whether or not it was a telecom provider or if it was a wireless provider, because the DAS systems many times don't actually provide service. They simply host carriers that are going to provide that service. And the answer that came back from the commission, yes, they are under the protection of 332C7 and by extension 6409. So what's on the page there is a couple of examples of what DAS looks like. That middle one there gives you an idea. Let's see if I can't do this point here. This one here gives you an idea about the extension that we might be talking about. This diagram here just seeks to reflect that this is what you traditionally had, right? You had one large tower that would serve this whole circumference. What increasingly the industry is going to is for smaller towers that serve the same area, but what they do is by reducing it, they're able to more efficiently use their spectrum. So the question is, or the answer is that it clearly applies, 6409 clearly applies to DAS. If you are wondering whether or not we're finished with the challenge of siting cell towers or siting wireless devices, the answer is no. We may only be at the beginning of a whole new growth pattern. If folks question that, I'll give you an example. The FCC is in the middle of conducting an auction right now on some spectrum. And most folks going in thought that spectrum was going to generate about $20 billion. Actually, people are going to be thrilled if they generate $15 billion, because that would be enough to pay for a thing called FirstNet, which is a public safety deployment, and throw off another $8 billion for deficit reduction. As of today, that auction, the prices that have been generated by that auction are north of $42 billion. So if anybody's wondering whether we've seen the end of the growth in the wireless sector and the demand for wireless sector infrastructure, the answer is pretty clearly no. If anything, it will ratchet up. So what is it that we're talking about when we're talking about these additional towers that need to be put up, these additional wireless areas? Here's a picture, and I look at this photo, and this could be downtown Decatur or the Peachtree section of Atlanta, or whether it be Savannah or downtown Athens. In fact, it's Charlotte, but I offer it because what we're talking about today is where these different devices are going to be deployed. And, you can see them right here. We're going to see anything that's vertical will be a real target, whether it's the rooftop, whether it is this pole, but we're also going to see them on things like light poles or these city, this sort of street furniture all along here. And the problem is, and this is the biggest challenge, if I could reduce it to a single challenge, the biggest challenge as we get into this is you're going to learn that every time you approve a site, you need to conceptualize that that site can grow from what it is today to 10 by 6, 10 feet tall, 6 feet wide, without any objection or your ability to control that. And that's the real challenge I believe that's going to be facing folks across the board, is that the little pencil application that we might have seen in the past that would go on top of a light pole or on top of this street light. Moving forward, the challenge is that that single deployment can now grow to be 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, regardless of the size of either the instrument, the antenna, or the support structure on which it stands. So here's the rule. Here's the rule. It's there. It's pretty. It means nothing to me because it's too long. Let's try to look at that same rule to me in plain English. And now what we're going to do is we're going to parse this rule. So what Section 6409 says is that state and local governments may not deny and shall approve any request that involves a co-location, removal, or replacement of transmission equipment of an existing wireless tower or base station that does not substantially change the physical dimensions of such a tower or base station. That's the rule in simple English. And now what we're going to do is we're going to try to learn to understand the rule by parsing it. And so what I'm going to try to do is repeat that statement over and over again, and then the highlighted text will reflect the way that the commission defined those terms. Again, the difficulty for the commission was it got this rule from the Congress with none of these terms defined. We will go through and we will see how they define it, and we will see how, in fact, that definition differs from the Build Act, and it will. Now, I need to find my cursor here. Somehow I disappeared on me. Let me see if I can. There it is. Sorry about that. So the first thing is wireless tower. A wireless tower is defined as any structure built for the sole or primary purpose of supporting any commission licensed or authorized antennas and their associated facilities. Now, there's a growth here because it's not just cellular, right? It could be broadcast, it could be Wi-Fi, anything that's using commission licensed or authorized. So authorized means it could be unlicensed, is entitled to this if the structure was built for that sole purpose. So what does that mean? Let's give you some examples. So each of these would be a tower, right? Each of these would be a tower. Why? Because they're built for the sole purpose of supporting some sort of device that's going to deploy a wireless service. The one in the middle was a traditional radio tower that was turned into a cell tower. The other two are stealth facilities, but again, both were built for the specific purpose. There's no difference here, by the way, from the build. Here is where the difference comes in. The commission defines base station as the equipment and non-tower supporting structure at a fixed location that enables commission licensed or authorized wireless communication service communications between the user equipment and a communications network. Let me see if I can put that in plainer English. It's the transmission equipment itself and any non-tower structure. So again, what's a non-tower structure? It's a structure that's supporting wireless devices, but it was not built for the sole purpose of supporting such equipment. Let's see if we can put that in English or in real life. Here are two examples of base stations, right? You've got, let's see if I can't use this. You've got, this tower here is supporting wireless equipment in it. And here you have a light, right? This was originally created to be a street light, but it is supporting this other equipment. So neither one of these fits into the category of being a traditional tower, but because it supports authorized wireless equipment, it makes it a base station. And the base station, unlike the Build Act, the base station itself can grow under the 6409 rules without your objection if it does not substantially change the characteristics of the facility. So the FCC tries to define what is and is not a substantial change to the physical dimensions of the tower or the base station. And to do that, they tried to create an objective standard that evaluates the change on 6 different factors. So that's the height, the width, new equipment cabinets, deployment or excavation beyond the current site, concealment elements, and other conditions. Again, those are the 6 items that are going to go in to determine whether or not you are substantially changing the physical dimensions of the tower. Note that unlike the Build Act, there is no category for weight. But I would argue that there is a category for weight because under other conditions, you can require that any change comply with all objective standards. So for most of us, that means things like our safety and structural codes. So I believe that weight still does come in. So let's see what are the parameters for whether or not something is a substantial change. For height, if we're talking a traditional tower and towers that are not located in the rights of way, if the modification increases the tower by more than 10% or the height of one additional antenna array with separation from the nearest existing antenna not to exceed 20 feet, whichever is greater, right? So if I've got a 100-foot antenna and I need 20 additional feet to have separation from the nearest antenna array, then I'm going up to 110. Right? If, however, my existing antenna array is at 90 feet, then I'm going up to 110 because that would be sufficient to achieve the array and be within 10 feet. Again, for height, if we are talking about towers in the rights of way and all base stations, if the modification increases the facility by more than 10 feet, 10%, pardon me, or more than 10 feet, whichever is greater. Again, the commission could have done us a great service here if they would say whichever is lesser, because there's a real problem that, again, something that might have been a foot tall can now grow to be 11 feet. Something that, we'll talk about the width in a second, but something that was pencil thick can now go to be 6 feet wide. So that's the height change. Important to one of the biggest problems, or one of the largest fears that we had in this area was that we knew we were going to get this 10% from the get-go. Our fear was that there would be no baseline, so that I could come in, if I have a 100-foot tower, I could grow it to 110 feet in 2014, and then come back again in 2015 and grow it to 121 because the 10%, it's sort of the old idea that we all learned about going to the bank and compounding, right? Our fear was that these things would mushroom and continue to bud. So one of the things that we were grateful for is that the commission did make clear that height and width are measured by the size of the tower or base station as it existed on February the 22nd, 2012. And the reason for that date is that that's the day that the law was effective. The middle class tax bill was effective. And so the commission felt that it would not be fair, for instance, suppose someone had a deployment in Savannah that started off at 100 feet and they'd already gotten permission to grow it to 120. It wouldn't be fair to then lock that system out, they thought, at 100 feet. So they're entitled to be 120 feet because that's where it was on February the 22nd, 2012. Now, if I'm a city, if I'm a county, if I'm a municipality in Georgia, I'm not sure how I go about ascertaining what that baseline is. I think that you can put the onus on the applicant to demonstrate what the size was on February 22nd, 2012. And if you question that, then you can go back in and see what the original approval was and see whether or not there have been any amendments. But again, the growth starts on February 22nd, 2012, and it's limited to 10% in terms of height. And with respect to width, for towers other than towers in the rights of way, you can go out more than 20 feet or more than the width of the tower structure at the level of the appurtenance. So what does that mean? And that means that if I've got one of these lattice towers and at its base, say it's 40 feet across, and I'm putting something on 5 feet up, then I can go another 40 feet out. If I'm installing something at the top of the tower where it's only 10 feet wide, then I can only go out 20 feet, again, because it's whichever is greater. So that's a pretty substantial standard, again, for a traditional tower. Most people, as I understand it, aren't really troubled by the traditional towers. It's the non-traditional towers, the rights-of-way deployments that cause the greatest difficulty. And so let's learn what that is. So for other towers or base stations, i.e. those that are involved in the right-of-way, you do not substantially change the physical dimensions of such a tower or a base station unless you go out more than 6 feet. Oops, excuse me. I'm missing something here. Oh, all right, it's more than 6 feet. Again, the whole idea here is that you're taking pencil-thin applications and they're now going to be allowed to go out 10 feet. And the reason for this is because Verizon went in on an ex parte meeting just before the order was issued and was able to demonstrate that they need a 6-foot separation on an array so that they don't have interference. And that's where this came from. So perhaps I'm providing a misservice or painting a wrong image when I say 10 by 6. Because I think of that as a solid or a block. I think the other folks would argue, no, we could simply go out that far, but most of that would be air. Well, that may be technically true, but it can also be a solid, and I think that's our grave difficulty, and I think that's the obligation that each of you will have to your elected officials and to your zoning boards to say to them, just understand anytime that you grant any permit moving forward, understand that at a minimum, that site can grow to be 10 by 6. Equipment cabinets, again, is a significant change from build, because build limits growth to actual equipment, not this ancillary stuff. But what the rule is that if it involves installing more than the standard number of cabinets for the technology involved, it is a substantial change. And then they create an objective standard, and that is up to 4. So every time somebody wants to install new equipment, they can increase the number of cabinets up to 4, with it being sort of entitled to this fast track under 6409. Again, this is why one of our recommendations is that people should really think about adopting the preference to public facilities, and then as the landlord, you can do a better job of policing the amount of equipment that can be deployed. Again, for towers in the rights of way and all base stations, if it involves the installation of any cabinets, if there are no pre-existing cabinets, or involves installation of ground cabinets that are more than 10% larger in height or overall volume than any associated ground cabinets. So again, the lesson here is that there's 2 standards almost across the board, whether it be for height, for width, for equipment cabinets. The first question you have to ask yourself, are you talking about a traditional tower that's not located within the rights of way, or are you talking about a new tower that is in fact located in the rights of way? As we go down again, remember I said that there were 6 standards that the commission, 6 objective standards that the commission created. We'll move to the next one, and that is excavation or deployment beyond the site. The request, it is a substantial change in the physical dimensions of the tower or the base station if the request involves excavation or deployment outside of the current site. Site is defined for towers other than those in the rights of way as being the current boundaries of the leased or owned property surrounding the tower and any access or utility easements. That's troublesome to me. I do a lot of these types of agreements, and the utility easements can run, for hundreds, if not thousands of feet. And so that'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But right now, again, if it's an excavation beyond the site, it is a substantial change and therefore is not entitled to 6409A treatment. Again, in the rights of way, if the request involves excavation or deployment outside of the site, it is a substantial change and therefore not entitled to the fast track. And for purposes of the rights of way, the depth site is defined as restricted to the area in proximity to the structure and other transmission equipment already deployed on the ground. I wish I could give you an insight as to what that means. I don't have it. And more importantly, the commission doesn't have it. And so I suspect that sometime down the road, we will all litigate what in proximity to the structure and to other transmission equipment means. But just know, again, that there's a different standard for a traditional tower versus a tower located within the rights of way. It's a substantial change if the change would defeat concealment elements. All right? So what does that mean? For concealed or stealth design facilities, a modification defeats these elements of either the wireless tower or the base station. I'll give you an example. This is a concealment element. This is a tower here. That it's not a base station; it's a tower because this is not a real live silo. It was built for the specific purpose of supporting these devices here. Okay, that if they requested those changes, right, and if those changes, for instance, fit, right, they fit within the 20-foot array in terms of height. Width doesn't matter because they're not really going beyond the existing structure. But that would not be entitled to a 6409A fast track. Why? Because this was allowed to be deployed under the stealth requirement this would defeat the stealth. Therefore, you can deny it under 6409. The next question is, they probably come up back under 332C7, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Here's another example, right? Another tower, traditional tower, not in the rights of way. Over here, you've got the addition, right? Again, if we, just for argument's sake, say this addition fits within the category of the height and the width, there's no excavation, there's nothing else, but because this was authorized as a stealth deployment, and this would defeat the stealth deployment, you can deny it the fast track under 6409. The last category that would deny someone from being able to get the fast track is if the application would defeat other conditions. Specifically, the modification would not comply with other conditions imposed on the applicable wireless tower or base station unless the non-compliance is due to an increase in height, increase in width, addition of cabinets, new excavation that does not exceed the substantial change thresholds. So here are examples of defeating other conditions. If they now need to put additional fencing around the site, and that fencing had not been prior approved, or there was fencing that was there and that's negatively impacted, that's defeating another condition. If there is additional or increased access to the site that was not contemplated in the original grant, that could defeat the substantial change standard. And then finally, if it negatively impacts the drainage of the site, again, it's not entitled to the fast track under 6409. So we also want to capture defeating other conditions, because almost every one of you, when you issue a permit, states something like, and this, that the construction, operation, and maintenance shall at all times be done in strict compliance with applicable codes and standards. And if I'm making that up, somebody, send me a smiley face saying that I'm making it up. But no, so our point is, and the commission agrees with this, that other standards, right? This other conditions means that modifications remain subject to building codes and other non-discretionary structural and safety codes. Actually, I argue with my colleague Matt Schettenhelm here. I believe that this should be more properly written: building codes and other non-discretionary codes, such as structural and safety codes, because you may have some sort of other non-discretionary code in your jurisdiction. I'm thinking of things like maybe you use the electrical code rather than the fire safety. I mean, I know that most of the world has changed from having sort of the regional safety and fire and building codes, but maybe you've got something that's unique to you. I mean, for instance, perhaps you have a hurricane code, your Savannah, or you have a fire safety, because you're out in western Georgia. If your code, if your obligation is non-discretionary, that is, you're not creating it just for these wireless deployments, then if the modification defeats any of those, then it's not entitled to the fast track under 6409. Addition requests must still comply with any relevant federal requirements, including things like the FAA, NEPA, and historic preservation. So these, I hope, are your takeaways. Right? There are objective standards, right? So it's based on height, width, number of cabinets, excavation, compliance, and compliance with prior conditions. If any of those are not met, then you can deny the fast track of 6409. Again, a reminder that there are lower thresholds for sites in the rights of way and things that are mounted on buildings, right, or in the rights of way. Actually, Trip May is a dear friend. He and I did a presentation, and he uses this expression, and I stole it from him with permission. What Trip likes to say is that every time you sort of grant one of these new locations, you need to sort of in your mind understand that you are authorizing an invisible envelope around the structure within which wireless infrastructure can be freely modified. Wireless infrastructure can be freely modified, including the transmission equipment and the support devices, things like generators and backup generators, etc. Okay. Important is that it's disjunctive. The application request must comply with all to be entitled to 6409A fast track. If you violate even one, then the application needs to be reviewed under 332C7. In my opinion, only if the applicant resubmits under 332C7. As I'm going to talk about later in the program, I think one of the first things you're entitled to do is make the applicant tell you under what standard are they applying, and then apply those rules. And then the cumulative, that's the budding, that we talked about, that goes back to February of 2012. Again, so that's hopefully your takeaway. Another way of looking at it is key lessons. 6409 does not apply to your proprietary rights, so it doesn't apply to your leasing. 6409 permits modifications of small cells and underlying support structures, not just cell towers. Big difference with build, right? Big difference, because build didn't capture these new base stations. And to be eligible for 6409, a facility has to have been approved at least once. So what that means is that while every edifice has the ability to be a base station, it is only a base station if you have approved it once in your history. So again, I'll steal Martin Clark. He's out at the airport, and suppose you all decided that the tower would serve also as a way to make a couple extra bucks. You're gonna let some of the commercial folks go up on that. Well, you turn the control tower into a base station for purposes of 6409. But until you approved that in your regulatory capacity, not your proprietary capacity, until you approved that, it was simply a control tower. It was not a base station. The other big lesson is any approved wireless equipment may generally be modified if it honors safety codes, preserves stealth, and extends less than 10 feet up and 6 feet out. Again, just trying to give you some sort of thumbnail things to live by.